Hi, and welcome back to Continual. Tonight on Continual Fandom, we're diving into the apocalypse. We're going to have a little bit of fun with the end of the world. So I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and let's see who our intrepid party and who will get to survive all the way to the end. Rachel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I would. Hi, I'm Rachel Brune, and I am the author of the Rick Keller Project, which is a werewolf secret agent series out from Falstaff Books. I'm also the founder and editor at Chrome Girls Press. We publish horror anthologies. That's our niche. And finally, I also edit horror for Falstaff Dread, which is their horror line.
Jonathan.
Jonathan Maberry. I'm a multi-genre author, comic book writer for Marvel, IDW, and Dark Horse, anthology editor. In fact, just wrapping up a couple of them right now, and editor of Weird Tales magazine.
And Marx.
Hey, Marx Pyle. I'm a author, podcaster, filmmaker, and dabble or write a lot in urban fantasy, but I dabble in other genres too.
So let's actually sort of kick off the idea of what flavors of apocalyptic you tend to like and write in, and why. So Rachel, I'm going to throw that one to you to start with.
Well, I'm kind of a Baskin Robbins sort of reader in which I just love apocalypses. So I'll read whatever you've got.
Your 10th one is free.
Don't say that out loud. The universe is listening. But I do tend to but I do tend to read a lot where the apocalypse is something that comes about because of mankind, humanity. We've done something specifically to cause it that we absolutely knew would cause it, and we did it anyway. Maybe because I'm a sucker for punishment. Maybe I started as a journalist, so I feel like that's, but yeah, that's my favorite flavor.
Jonathan, you're going to have to choose here as to where that favorite falls. I know.
Well, I do have a favorite, but I also started as a journalist, so I do like the what I call fact-based apocalyptic fiction, where it's built on a framework of science. I like the apocalypse unfolding. That's my favorite zone. Whether it gets prevented, which I do in my Joe Ledger series, it's all about preventing the apocalypse, or whether it's things are falling apart right around us. Ideally, that moment when the infrastructure is about to collapse, because what happens there is you lose all of the people that can come and save you, and then you have to define who you are in crisis. And to me, that's the real meat. And I was turned on to it, by the way. I fell in love with that kind of fiction when I was 12. 13. Richard Matheson gave me a copy of I Am Legend for Christmas, and that book, 1954 book, is, to me, the Bible of how to write an apocalyptic story, because it's pre-apocalyptic, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, and dystopian, all in one very short novel. It's, so yeah, the science-based apocalyptic fiction, as it unfolds, that's my zone.
Marx?
I do think the reality-based is important, but because we can't stop that. We can't stop Cthulhu, but we could stop climate change or something else. But I do like what Jonathan said. I enjoy stories where the apocalypse might happen, or you see it unfold and how it occurs and stuff too. So, the one apocalypse story I've written actually is after the fact, and I do touch on some reality-based stuff, but I don't really. It's all kind of mysterious and stuff as I allude to it. But so I think it's a nice mix. But I think seeing it unfold is a lot of fun. Supernatural. I don't know if we're going to talk about that one, for example. They've stopped the apocalypse many times. We get to see what it could have happened.
Gee, and most of the apocalyptic stuff I write's white papers, so it's it's trying to figure out how we actually make it happen. Oh no, sorry. How we stop it from happening. That's the phrase. So kind of with this idea, we want to look at the idea of apocalyptic horror, but what about that supernatural side of it? Again, a lot of the time when we look at stuff that's apocalyptic, we pull in things like, I don't know, vampires. Jonathan, I know you wouldn't know anything about that at all. We pull in supernatural creatures that give that edge. They give that reason for what's happened. Even a lot of the time we try to then go and give a scientific reasoning for how some of those things would come about. Vampires, zombies, we see a lot of these sorts of things that are representative of various kinds of plagues. Like look at The Last of Us, right? Where it's how do we make something plausible? So, Jonathan, I'm going to throw this one to you first. How do you take some of these kinds of ideas of supernatural elements, but make them plausible?
Okay, well, the funny thing is, my vampires in V-Wars are not supernatural. They are scientific. It's genetic disorder. The zombies in Rotten Ruin are not supernatural. They are the result of a bioweapon that got loose. So I actually don't write, for the most part, a supernatural apocalyptic fiction. I do like to impose monsters on a scientific story, though. So with V-Wars, the way that got started, I had read an article about, and this is going back 2010, 2011, read an article about how, melting permafrost, was releasing ancient viruses and bacteria and so on. And our, writer's job, especially guys like us, who are, we're genre writers, we don't look at, oh, that could be a pleasant story. We look at, well, what's the worst that can happen? And that's our, So that's how I pitched V-Wars, that, melting polar ice released an ancient disease that triggered dormant genes that code for a series of symptoms. And in the past, those symptoms were collectively what people thought as vampires. Body changes, physiological deformities, chemical changes in the brain that cause behavioral changes, and so on. And I found that to be a very fascinating way to approach that, because I had already written supernatural vampires in other novels, but they were not apocalyptic. The Pine Deep story was almost, but not quite apocalyptic. It was stopped. So when I wrote V-Wars, I wanted to see what would happen if this became a thing that we could no longer edit out of our real life. With zombies, I reached out to experts. I'm a science geek, but I'm not a scientist. So my journalism background really helped with this. So I looked for experts who would have insight into how things would work if zombies were real. And I originally did that for a nonfiction book called Zombie CSU, The Forensic Science of the Living Dead. I talked to over 250 experts, all different fields. And the weird thing is, the fun thing, is that every single expert I talked to had already given some thought about zombies. Whether it was a pathologist, EMTs, all these different specialties, even to the clergy. I talked to a couple of guys in the clergy just for the hell of it, and yeah, they thought of it, because there are moral implications, religious implications if the dead rise, and so on. So I built it I built it using an old con man bit of advice: use 9 truths to sell 1 lie. So if I use 90% real science to build up the story, and even if I'm introducing vampires or zombies or something else, there's so much real science in there, and makes it hard for the reader to know where I have gone off of the scaffolding and into pure fiction. And that makes it fun for the reader, I've been told by readers, and certainly fun for me as the writer, because it's close to plausible. Just one quick thing about that. Uh-huh. When I was doing the zombie one, I talked, my most recent series, the Dead of Night series, I used parasites for that and for the Rotten Ruin series. And I talked to parasitologists around the world. And I was hoping to get to about 20% doable for a zombie apocalypse, because that would have been enough. They got me to 70% doable using bioengineering and CRISPR gene editing. And I'm like, holy crap, some idiot's going to try this at some point. So we didn't go too far into the actual details of how it's done. But science can get really scary. So I literally have scientists on speed dial when for all my different stories, so that I can always make sure there is real stuff in there that people can go and look up and like, oh shit, that's actually real or possible.
Marx, how about you?
I think so. I love Lovecraftian apocalypse, but if you do it wrong, it can come out goofy, right? So I do think having a little bit of reality mixed in is really helpful. I didn't really think about it, but I do have a slight journalism background too. I used to work at TV news station and stuff too, so maybe that's where it comes from. But I think it touches on something that there is that aspect of truth that makes it a little more frightening, I guess, because it could happen. And what we have, like in news, we had those people taking bath salts and eating people, and then we had the military supposedly. I don't know if that was true or not, but like running drills in case there's a zombie apocalypse or something. And you hear that stuff in the news, it makes people go, "Oh my gosh!" And then it just makes it feel a little more like it could happen, and that makes it scary.
There may be a little truth to that, by the way.
There may be, yeah. So it is nice. I do try to mix in a little truth in my stuff. Even the urban fantasy, there is a little layer of sci-fi in there to kind of ground it a little bit in there. So I do think that makes it a little scary, because I think like a biblical apocalypse can be scary, because especially in the West, because even if you're not a Christian or a backsliding Christian, you still got that in your background, your DNA a little bit. So there's a little bit of it triggers something kind of primitive there, fearful. Mm-hmm. But if you try to pull apocalypse from some other religion, it would come off goofy to us probably, unless you rooted it in something, unless they're aliens or something. But anyway, yes, I think rooting in a little bit in reality makes it that much scarier, because it could maybe happen. And I do believe that science, I really think anything's possible with science eventually. So, anything you can imagine in some way could become reality through science.
Well, and just remember, FEMA does prepare with zombies and with kaiju.
You gotta be ready.
Rachel?
So there's a trope that I actually really enjoy, and that's the apocalypse happens and then opens the door for supernatural elements to return to Earth. So thinking about like S.M. Sterling's Dies the Fire, yep. A little bit of Gail and Larry Martin's Wasteland Marshals. So like we've done this to ourselves, but once technology is no longer the driving force, once the world is starting to get greener and people are by necessity going back to nature, then there's where the door to fairy opens, or there's where the genus loci can come back and be part of a community. So I really, really enjoy those. I'm trying to think of a couple of other examples, but those were the two that came right off the top of my head. I will also say that I would totally read a goofy apocalypse. Like if you were like, here's a book full of goofy apocalypse stories, I'd be like, well, hand it right over, because we've been having a terrible apocalypse for the past 3 years and I'm ready for goofy.
This is not the apocalypse I was promised.
Maybe we need an apocalypse where everybody becomes a stand-up comic that just becomes the thing.
And check out Facebook Reels. I think it's happening.
Pretty much, yeah.
So, Jonathan, you said you didn't have anything to do for the rest of the year. You can start that anthology now.
Yeah, between projects. So it is a good idea for an anthology.
It is, yeah.
Better do it first, Rachel, or I'll steal it.
A funny thing happened on the way to the apocalypse. So Marx, mm-hmm. I'm going to throw this out there, since we just all were sort of talking about it a little bit. All four of us at least have some background in journalism. When we look at things like Max Brooks, the way he did World War Z, do you think that there are good elements that come out of the idea of having been a journalist on how you tell an apocalyptic story?
I think so. I think because you see the news every day, and you see the possible threads of that could become apocalypse down the line, right? And then you also, as a journalist, know how to tell kind of a compact story too, and tell it in an efficient way too. That can be very helpful as a writer. So yeah, I can see where that would work out. That would be a very helpful tool to have, because I think you're in tune with the world constantly. When you're a journalist, you're always seeing stuff, even if you're not thinking about it. You're digesting that, and it's kind of filtering in the back of your mind. So usually, even if you don't try, I think a lot of stuff you would mention historically or whatever, like World War Z, perhaps different. The different political aspects and repercussions and stuff that it could play with, they're just going to flow right out because it's like in your memory banks. and then I like telling. I don't do it very often, but I do like telling stories through like reports like that. Like I think that's interesting. I mean, it's like with Dracula, right? You had journal entries and stuff like that too. It gives this extra layer of authenticity in a way to it that makes it feel a bit more like this is something real. So,
Rachel?
So I actually started out as a military journalist.
oh, hey.
So
Yeah, that might have been.
it's a different perspective, but at the same time, I think that yes, you as a journalist, whether you're doing it for the New York Times or whether you're doing it for the true paper that you are also publishing and printing, I think that you have to get to know people very quickly. And you have to be able to describe them very quickly. So if you're doing a story, you need to be able to size someone up, choose the quotes that are going to represent what the story that they're telling you, and then craft the rest of the story around that. And I think that's basically what we do as writers. I do think that if we're writing an apocalypse, I think that, we saw in the past, when the pandemic came around, we were experiencing it through just this kind of panorama of news, right? So we had, of course, the official news sources. Here's the local paper, here's the national paper, here's the international paper, and then we had Joe Snuffy on the street corner with their video camera or their camera phone going, well, this is what the apocalypse means to me. And then you had memes and you have all of these different things. And I think as writers, if we're going to go and we're going to talk about an apocalypse that's going to start happening today or tomorrow, there's just a wealth of content and ways of explaining how things happen that we can exploit, both news that happens on the official news channels and the news that is created by folks in the various social media avenues that we have.
Yeah, and I'm going to, well, all of that, what both of you said is dead on. A couple things about journalism, though, is one of the things when you study newspaper journalism or magazine feature writing, which is mostly what I did for the first 30 years of my writing career as magazine features, journalism teaches you how to get to the heart of the story so you can find your hook, because otherwise it's just general information on a topic. A good news story, a good feature is some element about that is explored a little more deeply, often bringing in other points of view. And what I found is by using that journalistic approach, first I can find my experts. And one of the ways I do that is I look for news stories on a topic. So if I wanted a news story, if I wanted information on, say, prion diseases, I would look up prion, the word controversy, and the word expert, and see which articles popped up, see who's being quoted, because they always want, in news stories, we want our sources to be rock solid. So journals would always give, top sources, and they would always give the credential of where that person is, what organization they belong to. Well, every organization has a website. Every website has a contact page. So you can actually go and get, instead of what my professor used to call dead quotes, meaning a quote that's already been published and everyone has access to, I like getting live quotes, what that expert says now. I did this when I was doing Zombie CSU. I did this with Dr. Wade Davis. Everybody quotes his Serpent in the Rainbow nonfiction book. And yeah, it's a good book, but it's decades out of date. And he doesn't even like referencing it anymore because he's done so much research since that his understanding of the topic, and he was an ethnobotanist who went down to Haiti to figure out how zombies work. Turns out it's chemical, and he figured out the chemistry. But he found out so much more about it. His understanding of that type of chemistry and its variations deepened. So when I wanted to use a quote from Wade Davis to separate the Haitian zombies from the Romero zombies, I went to Wade Davis and got a quote nobody else has, because we were on the phone. We got on the phone. And that gave me an original live quote. Now, also, when I'm doing this sort of research, and I guess when all of us do it, we talk to experts, we ask two questions I love asking experts. After, I give them idea of what my plot is and let them correct it, because what you assume about a plot and what's actually, in science, way different. But I ask two questions. One is, what don't I know enough about the subject to even ask you? That opens a lot of doors, because there are things people in any profession want to tell people because they see it misrepresented so often in pop culture or whatever. And the other thing, which gets me some of my great plot ideas, is what's the weirdest or most original thing happening in your field right now? And, I've heard some really bizarre stories from these experts. Like I knew about Zika before it was in the news because I was talking to an epidemiologist who told me, oh, well, you should write about this. This is coming. And I was able to write about it. Same with some of the stuff about drones and autonomous drive systems and nuclear power and other things that the public doesn't know because the public knows what the public tells each other. And an expert who's working in the field can tell you what they know now, what's on the bleeding edge now. And if we get that information from them and write it into our stories, then our stories have this prophetic quality to them. It makes us look really smart, but thank God for experts, right? But it allows us to have stuff out there before it becomes part of the public conversation in an article that winds up in, say, USA Today. We had it first because we asked the experts who are working on it now.
So looking at, at the end of the day, when we look at an apocalyptic setup, whether it's technological, whether it's war, whether it is societal, whether it is biological, whatever it is, fundamentally it's a setup that lets us stress people, right? It's the great joy of let's go torture a character. Let's go see how far we can take them, break them, whatever we're going to go do. Because again, that's why we're writers, is we're sick, twisted people that we want to, it's easier to do that and get away with it than it is to actually do it to somebody that's living. So Rachel, what is your favorite thing to go, whether it's to read it, see it, write it, in terms of playing with people and characters in that kind of an apocalyptic setting?
One of my favorite things is when a character does not act in alignment with how they thought themselves or how they thought that they would act in a stressful situation. It's the grown adult who pushes the kid out of the way to get on the last boat, right? Or it's the person who just tells a lie of like the little tiny things that they didn't think that they would do in the normal life, in the normal times. And they thought they would be heroes in the apocalypse, but they're not because they're human. And that's absolutely one of my favorite things. It's one of the reasons why I absolutely love horror, because it's showing characters that are human, even though I do like superheroes, but it's showing us that, hey, people are going to make mistakes. People are going to die from those mistakes. And sometimes there's not anything that anybody can do about it.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm gonna definitely go with that. I love any story where the crisis is so big. I mentioned the collapse of infrastructure. What happens in those circumstances is we all play a version of ourselves, and actually different versions of ourselves depending on where we are. We're one version with our friends, another with our spouse, another with our boss, and so on. And none of those versions are actually real. We may feel them as reality in the moment, but they're not real. We're putting on a play, we're acting a role. When the apocalypse happens and all of society is collapsing, we can't hide behind affectation anymore. We have to become our central selves. So in a crisis, a captain of industry who, can snap his fingers and everything is done for him and he's born to money and he equates money with power, could be the person least likely or least capable of leading the team trapped in his office building to safety during an apocalypse. Whereas the guy who's running the falafel stand down on the street, who has to do his own repairs at home because he can't afford to call in people, has to do everything himself, has had to rely on himself, maybe even educate himself, that person may be much more capable of leading people in a catastrophe because he's more resourceful in the moment. And, when we start using that as a device for then examining characters, you can have a soldier who's not able to lead. You can have a secretary who is. You can change the model all the way around. And what that gives you is an endless number of stories you can tell about real people. Like I love zombie stories, zombie movies, TV shows, and so on. I've written 20 zombie novels and comics. My characters are seldom the spotless hero. They're usually the person who is there at the moment. And if they're the one who can make a good decision, people will follow the charismatic leader, emerging. If there's somebody who can't make a good decision, the people who follow him or her will die. And then you have that element. Both are good stories to tell. And it's funny, you mentioned torturing characters. Actually, it's funny, I don't enjoy torturing my characters. I enjoy putting my characters in situations where they can't be themselves and have to find out whether they are strong or not. And that has always appealed to me as a reader. I love stories where, and Dracula, Marx mentioned Dracula. The characters in it, except for Van Helsing, none of them are prepared to go up against a vampire. They have to learn, and then through unity, kind of find out who's the leader, who's the follower, who's the muscle, who's the brains, and they form that team as they go along. They become somewhat superheroic by the time they confront Dracula in his castle, but individually, none of them would survive against Dracula, not even Van Helsing. So they had to, to strip away who they are, the rich nobleman, the cowboy, all those characters, had to strip away who they are and be what was needed in the moment. I love those kinds of stories to read, and I love those kinds of stories to tell.
Marx?
Yeah, like everybody's saying, post-apocalyptic really is a great character study. You put them in the worst case scenarios and they're pushed to do things that may not have done before, or really show what kind of character they are. Like Last of Us, people, one of the big things about that is like the end of Last of Us. Did he make the right decision or not? That's a lot of talk about that. But there's a couple other episodes that focus just on one or two characters and basically like from beginning to the end, and then they die. So it's like a whole life cycle of a character almost. And it's such a great examination for the actor to do and for the writing of those characters. Another example that always comes to mind, I don't know if it's technically post-apocalypse, like The Apocalypse, but like The Mist. I think it shows all these people push in different directions and they all kind of latch on. They all react different ways, and some good, some bad. And it really shows how would people deal with such a crazy scenario, or the push to the brink. And even the movie took it further. Like there's a whole thing, they changed the ending and stuff. And if you like it or don't like it, you remember it at least. So, so
Stephen King liked it.
Yeah, it was very shocking. And so I think something about post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic stories, it's a great time to really examine pushing the characters to the extreme and really learn something about humans, about being human.
So let's actually kind of play a little bit with how we go about building the apocalypse. Because again, I think we tend to think of an apocalyptic or a post-apocalyptic world as having affected the entire globe, right? But I think that, to your point, like The Mist, that could be considered an apocalypse on a local or a regional basis, right? If you look at a book like The Last Carolina Girl, which is written about, child in the 30s who is pulled into a society where, in essence, it's apocalyptic to her, right? Because we have to remember, what does apocalypse mean? It's a revelation. It's not necessarily just a disaster. It's what is, and this is to me kind of the thing that always fascinates me about the idea of apocalyptic fiction, is what does the idea of a disaster, a catastrophe, reveal not only about the individuals, but also about the society, the culture, the people that are in that place and in that time. So, Jonathan, when you think about crafting what you're going to come up with, whether it's biological, technology, I mean, a lot of the ones I've done are technologically driven, of course. But when you're playing with that idea, what are those influences? What are the things you want to look at as to how people react, how the society reacts, how the culture reacts? What's important to you?
Well, since I'm a city boy, I grew up in Philadelphia. I'm used to being in a place where resources are available. If the power goes out, the power will come back on. If the power goes out for too long, you can get in the car and drive out of the blackout zone to a store and buy candles and flashlights. I'm used to that level of comfort, and I'm not particularly handy with tools. I've never hunted, so I don't know how to hunt. So for me, a story, I tend to play a little bit to my own fears. If I was in a situation where it was beyond my skill set, I'm realistic enough to know how long I would last. When I was younger, fast zombies, I wouldn't have a problem with because I was pretty spry. I just turned 65 last week. I'm not outrunning zombies. I'm also not the smallest man in the world. I'm about the size of a well-fed bear. So outrunning zombies, not a thing. So what I want to do when I'm looking at something to build an apocalypse is, what do I have to do to the structure of society in order to make the apocalypse possible? Because like the standard Romero zombie apocalypse, the dead getting up and walking around slowly, between cell phones and everything else that we have now, we'd stop that in a matter of hours. It would never spread to an epidemic level. When I wrote about that in a novel, I had to have a superstorm come in to screw up cell phone reception and everything else. Otherwise, it could not have spread beyond today's protocols for containment. And so that becomes an approach. What will isolate someone? It's actually one of the reasons I like isolation stories like The Mist, one of probably my favorite of all Stephen King's works. And the movie version was great. The TV version was not. The movie version was great. The Thing, another, you have capable people in both versions of it. The 1951 version or 52, whenever that version was, and then Carpenter's version, in isolation stories. Cabin in the Woods sort of stories, whether it's a slasher because it becomes an apocalypse on a local level, that group is going to be exterminated if they don't respond. It may not be a global one. But the isolation thing enchants me as a writer. I like the fact that no help is coming. We are either going to survive or fail because of what we can do. So I look at it as, what do I have to do to the world as it is? How do I have to change it, break it, whatever, in order for me to tell an apocalyptic story that is reasonable without a modern 21st century reader going, oh, for God's sake, they can just pick up the phone and call someone. We need to be able to have that. It's funny because I was just rewatching some episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and only one character carries a cell phone. In that whole series, it was originally Charisma Carpenter in Cordelia in the first episode, and then later on Dawn gets one in the 7th season. No one else carries a cell phone. You'd think that would be a useful thing if you're out there fighting the monsters, but it would solve too many problems. So instead, they just simply didn't carry them, and that was such a glaring error that it annoys me on rewatch. And I don't like heroes or characters caught up in an apocalypse acting foolishly or cluelessly.
Marx?
Yeah, think about isolation. I think, I guess technically there's a Batman storyline, No Man's Land, where Gotham gets cut off from everybody, and the government just let's not touch this, and all the gangs and criminals take over and stuff. So that's very much a post-apocalyptic story, just isolated to Gotham. So yeah, it's about, you got to isolate. You got to stop them from finding a way to, stopping the apocalypse. So, I think that's, really, it is about isolation. It's about survival and finding a way to survive. So we have to have all of our usual safety nets removed for us to be pushed in that way. And, it's like, and we see how we react. So Last of Us has got the fungus type thing, the spores. They actually had to pull back on how it spread, because how it spread in the video game would just everybody would just be toast. If you breathe air, you're gonna get affected. So so you do have to play around with the logic of that and how it's going to spread, or how what has isolated people. I would even argue, it's not technically Apocalypse, but the show From it still hits all the same beats because it just isolates all these people in this town where just monsters come out every night and hunt them.
Well,
And it's very much
for them, though.
It's apocalyptic for them. I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting when you think about it that way. I mean, you really think about even right now in the world somewhere, if there's a plague going on, an isolated village or something, or there's warfare in a certain town that's being bombed to pieces, it's an apocalypse for them, right? So and I guess that's what makes it scary. You're only a few steps away from having our own apocalypse happen to us. So,
Rachel?
So I actually want to kind of take that and run with it. There's a book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, and then I think he wrote another one later on. It's a few years old at this point, but I remember reading that, and what he's doing is he's examining obviously the collapse of various civilizations, what happened, and it's never ever one particular factor. It's never, oh, the zombies appeared. It's economic, and then it's military, and then there's just breakdowns in trust and all of the social capital that holds us together. So for me, when I'm looking at Apocalypse, a lot of times that's really where I think there's going to be kind of a fertile place to go. You can read the news and you can see 1,000 tiny apocalypses every single day. Right? I was talking to a friend of mine in Europe. They're like, we didn't really expect that in this time and era, we would be fighting Russia on European soil. So it's like, I love reading apocalyptic fiction, but when I'm writing it, it's often with the idea that it really wouldn't take that much. It's, you can see it in so many different countries around the world and through history, so maybe it's not happening today, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years from now, you've got one country that's like, you know what, we're done. We're moving in. Or you have an internal conflict, internal strife. I mean, not to bum everybody out, but I honestly don't think that the apocalypse I don't think it's a sure bet that the apocalypse couldn't happen. I just think it's a matter of time. So,
and can I just throw one thing into that point?
Oh, sure.
We can see in recent culture the apocalyptic events. I mean, Columbus didn't discover America. There were 5 million people living here. They're mostly dead now. Their culture, a lot of their cultures are completely exterminated. Europeans were the apocalyptic force. They were the zombie invasion, so to speak, and they used germ warfare and everything else. And we see that all throughout history, groups that have been exterminated, the Nazis tried to do a Jewish apocalypse during World War II, as well as other groups, the homosexual group, the gypsies, all the other groups that they found not to their liking, they wanted to exterminate. And as a result, those people were caught up in an apocalyptic situation, almost to their point of extinction. So we can, we see it around us. So what you said, Rachel, about, the apocalypse, it's more a matter of when than if. Sadly, that's true. There will be something. It could anything from a CME to an asteroid. Ask the dinosaurs what they think about apocalypse. Oh, you can't.
Well, and that's kind of where it was steering with the question, is that idea of we are in a perpetual state of many apocalypses all the time. If we look at the ideas of fiscal, financial, political stability and whatnot, even with everything going on, this is still one of the more stable periods of time in history for most people, even with everything that's currently going on, if you compare this over time. Maybe taking the last year or so out of that equation. But, when we look at all of the things that are currently going on, we look at everything that is currently happening. If we just go back and look at the last 3 years, is there something you've seen that has come out of the news? How people reacted to the pandemic, how people reacted to the beginning of the war, how people have reacted to things that we see on a global scale right now that kind of have surprised you, and are the sort of things that would influence now maybe how you would change and tell that story? Or has it reinforced your idea of what people would be like? So, Marx?
Yeah, I would say a couple examples off the top of my head. I think the fear of like a World War III is probably what helped create such a strong response to Russia's invasion, for example. So I think if there wasn't all these World War III stories, maybe we would have just repeated history of World War II. Who knows? But I think that kind of a case where fiction maybe or the story that we told each other and also looking back at World War II and all the fiction from then maybe help drive a quicker response than maybe we would have if there weren't lessons learned there. And then an example in the reverse of that is like the pandemic. I think that was totally some reactions were totally like no writer would have thought of, like some of the stuff. How people react, like, no, I'm not wearing masks, or I'm not doing this, or what, it's just some of the disorder and chaos and just, like I look at even Sweet Tooth, some of the stuff they have there, I'm just like, I don't know, man. I don't think it would happen that way, actually. And now that we've had the pandemic, I'm not sure how it would happen. So I think a lot of those stories where we had about pandemics and stuff didn't quite play out the way we expected it for whatever reason. So it was interesting to see that.
Rachel?
So I don't know if anybody here has watched the show Jeremiah with it had yeah. So in the second season, you meet this fascist group that was basically set up through a psychological operation. It was supposed to be more like, hey, a comforting thing, and then it turned into a totalitarian state, like you do. And I think that one of the things that we can learn is how important it is to understand the information, maybe information operations, but the information systems that we live in that affect how we understand the world around us, because it's more complex than, oh, I just watch a certain news channel all the time and this is, what I believe. There's reinforcing messages, and there's cognitive dissonance, and there's bad actors, and sometimes you're like, well, okay, I'm gonna, shut all of my internet off and move to a cabin in the woods. No, I'm not. I've seen that movie twice.
Yeah, I have the internet at my cabin in the woods.
Right. So when it goes down, you're like, okay, that's it. I got to get out of here. Keep the truck fueled. But yeah, I really do. I think that when we are understanding the apocalypse, how that cognition piece, that understanding piece, like even if you shut off every single amount of telecommunications that you possibly could, you're still going to be dealing with people who have certain viewpoints and worldviews, and that's going to affect how they're going to listen to you, how they're going to be part of a community, whether or not they're going to listen to the most qualified person who can step up to take charge. If that qualified person doesn't look like someone that, they think, oh yeah, I've been around really qualified women all the time, I'll totally, follow that, female person into battle. That might not be part of their worldview. So I think that there's a lot of things to think about as humans, but also as writers when we're creating those worlds.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, I lost a lot of my faith in human survivability and common sense during COVID, and not because of the disease itself, because of the political response to it. It stopped being a response to a disease. It became a political fight. Each side had its point of view. Each side was different. And no matter what the other side said, each side had, the opposing view had to say that it was wrong. There was no middle ground. There was no space in between for a reason to discourse and an exchange of useful information. We've become too polarized. And that's terribly frightening to me as a human being, though it's a great opportunity for writing because I've used it already. But we can no longer trust what we see in the news. I mean, look at CNN. It's gone from hard left. It's swinging right now. Its message is dictated not by the reporters in there, but by whoever owns the company. We're seeing things like that happen where you can no longer trust a news source because that news source is owned by someone. And you can no longer trust social media messaging because we see right now politicians say the most ridiculous things. It gets the big news. Any response to it gets proportionately smaller views. So the big lie, no matter which lie it is, no matter who's saying the lie, is what more people hear. The qualifying response to it is not heard as often. And so disinformation has become so much more common, and that is frightening when it comes to health issues. Now, luckily, COVID, I mean, as terrible as it was not an airborne pathogen. If it had been an airborne pathogen with this same lack of cooperation on the other side, we'd have had 50 to 100 million dead in this country. Pretty easily, in fact. If something like Marburg or Ebola became an airborne pathogen, we're not going to survive that. We're not, because we don't cooperate. Groups that do cooperate will survive in isolation. And that's probably a plot for a good TV show somewhere down the road. My agent will probably watch this. But the point is, I don't think as a society we are currently able to protect ourselves from disaster. And if an apocalyptic situation comes up that can be in any way politicized, and so far it looks like everything can be politicized, sadly. I mean, when you can't go out and wear a shirt with a rainbow on it, no matter whether you are, LGBTQ or not, just that becomes the symbol of somebody's hate. When it gets that freaking stupid, we're in real trouble. And I think apocalyptic fiction, especially as we roll forward, I think is going to reflect a lot of that. The fact that we are much more our enemy than the zombies are.
Well, I mean, and often that's the point, is who's the bigger monster, right?
Well, Romero had it right back with Night of the Living Dead. If those people learned to cooperate, they would have survived.
So I just want to throw one last question out there. And Rachel, I'll let you go first because I know you got to bounce here in a minute. What's the one thing we haven't talked about that you think we should have?
I really do think that it's worthwhile talking about a military response. I've read some things that had a very realistic military response, and I've read some things where I was like, man, you don't know how the National Guard works, do you? So I would say that there's a lot of opportunity for like a good military, like a military focused apocalypse story out there. But before you write it, please come and talk to some veterans because there's some stuff that, we can tell you.
Jonathan?
What would I like to see in apocalyptic fiction?
What's the one thing you think we haven't talked about?
We haven't talked about. Actually, the educational value of apocalyptic scenarios. I know, I've worked with groups, like Homeland and other groups to help create outbreak protocols so that there are protocols on file. But talking to groups, like, I talk to kids a lot. And one of the things I do is, we have this conversation. How would you survive, or would you survive the zombie apocalypse? People rarely take stock of their own skills, their own things, and some of the stuff they can do, they don't think is of value. So I was in Italy a couple of years ago, and I was talking to a group of school kids about, asking each of them what's the thing they're best at. And, one kid, he said, his family are tailors and he's best at making clothes. And the other kids laughed at him. And I said, oh, no. First off, he can sew. So if you have a wound, you need that kid alive. Second, he can make you body armor, protective clothing, et cetera, et cetera. That kid is more valuable than somebody who has a black belt in karate because zombies don't feel pain. So, somebody who can fish, somebody who can do this, who can do basic carpentry, can do all these little skills. Even somebody who can tell a story becomes valuable, because if you survive the monster, you have to then survive the night and every night and every night. And culture and art and music and dance will do that. So talking about the value of each person by using the apocalypse as a discussion model, I think is something we haven't seen enough of, and I would like to see more of. Instead of, would you like fast or slow zombies? No. What's your reasonable plan? And who, how many people would you want in your group? For me, as many as possible, because there are that many, a community will survive, loners will not. Loners will suicide out after a year or two.
Marx?
How we need to hurry up and get a breakthrough in time travel because Skynet's almost here.
What's coffee snorted on that
one? Just remember, Skynet was much more likely to try to sell us something than it is to try to destroy us first.
No, I'm always excited to see different twists on post-apocalyptic stories and examining, society and characters that way. I tell you, one thing I want to see is that I haven't seen, at least in TV, is a good Alien Invasion series, because there was War of the Worlds that came out recently. I wasn't very happy with that. I don't know. That's a missing gap right now. I want to see that.
Fallen Skies wasn't too bad.
What's that? Fallen Skies?
Fallen Skies wasn't too bad.
It was pretty good, but it's been a while.
I'll even go back to V in the 80s. That was a prime miniseries. Well, I appreciate everybody coming in tonight to talk about the disaster and to form our merry little band to go trotting through the wilderness. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys, and of course, what pieces of apocalyptic fiction they need to pick up so that they can too survive what's coming. Rachel, you're up first.
So you can find me on linktree.com/Rachel A. Brune. And I would say that, if you're going to pick up any particular apocalyptic fiction, is it supposed to be ours or like somebody else's? Because I've got
whatever makes you happy. I'm easy.
Okay. I really enjoyed S.M. Sterling's Dies the Fire series, so I always recommend that. But if you would like to see my take on the apocalypse, I have a story called And Out Come the Wolves in Side Roads, which is a collection of dark fiction.
Jonathan?
Well, Jonathan Maberry. If you spell my last name right, you can find me. M-A-B, no Y in the middle. Maberry. I'm all over social media, so you can find me easy. I recommend by other people 2 books. I Am Legend, absolutely. And also, World War Z was a really good book on somewhat cynical, but cynically accurate, or accurately cynical, book on global politics as they would be in an unfolding apocalypse. Great book. For my own stuff, probably Dead of Night, because it's the one book I've written that is actually the apocalypse from the first bite. It's a zombie book, but it shows the politics of it, the medical side of it, the reporting, and all these different elements are, I have point of view characters in a lot of different areas. And it's as I feel, my most realistic book about the apocalypse. And it was George Romero's favorite zombie novel. So, it's actually the reason he and I became friends. So,
Marx?
I mean, we mentioned The Mist. I think that's just a fantastic story to read. And the movie too was great. And like Jonathan said, the series is TV series was, you can pass TV series. I don't know. I think, I feel like I spent so many hours talking about Supernatural here and elsewhere in Dragon Con that I feel like I got to mention Supernatural. So check that out. They have episodes that show the possible apocalypse, the Croatoan virus, and an alternate world, apocalypse world. So, and they're always trying to stop it. They're like Buffy with guns and cell phones.
Well, and I've had the pleasure of being your host tonight, Jim Nettles, and you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingprose.com, thespeculative-fiction-academy.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And we'll see everybody again soon.